The North Atlantic, March 1943. The water was black as oil under a moonless sky, and the wind carried salt and the promise of death. Beneath the surface, in the cramped steel belly of U-432, Captain Lieutenant Hermann Eckhart pressed his face against the cold periscope lens, scanning the horizon for the silhouette of Allied cargo ships. The rhythmic ping of sonar echoed through the control room like a heartbeat, steady and confident. For 2 years, the wolf packs had owned these waters. The convoy routes were their hunting grounds, and the merchantmen were their prey. The British called it the Battle of the Atlantic. The Germans called it turkey shoot season. Eckhart allowed himself a thin smile. The Allies were helpless. Their escorts were few, their defenses primitive, their losses catastrophic. Every week, dozens of ships went to the bottom, carrying fuel, food, and weapons meant for Britain. The island nation was starving. Churchill himself had admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. And the U-boat commanders knew it. They felt invincible. But that night, something was different. Eckhart heard it first, a sound that didn't belong, not the slow churn of a cargo freighter or the predictable rhythm of a British corvette. This was faster, sharper, more deliberate. He adjusted the periscope and froze. On the horizon, cutting through the swells with terrifying speed, was a destroyer he didn't recognize. Low profile, aggressive bow, American flag. He had heard rumors about them. The new American destroyer escorts flooding into the Atlantic by the dozen. But he had dismissed them as exaggeration. Now one was bearing down on his position, and it was moving like nothing he had ever seen. Before he could issue the order to dive, the destroyer's searchlight snapped on, illuminating the periscope like a spotlight on a stage. Eckhart shouted for emergency dive. The klaxon screamed. Men scrambled. But it was already too late. The first depth charge detonated 50 meters off the starboard side, and the entire submarine lurched sideways as if struck by a giant fist. Light bulbs shattered. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Water began to spray from a dozen hairline fractures in the hull. And in that moment, Captain Lieutenant Hermann Eckhart realized something that would haunt him for the 3 days he had left to live. The rules of the Atlantic had changed. For nearly 4 years, the German Kriegsmarine had waged the most ruthless and effective submarine campaign in naval history. By the spring of 1943, German U-boats had sunk over 2,300 Allied ships, totaling more than 11 million tons of shipping. The convoy routes between North America and Britain had become graveyards. Entire fleets of cargo vessels disappeared in a matter of hours, torn apart by torpedo spreads launched from submarines that struck without warning and vanished into the black depths before any counterattack could be mounted. The statistics were staggering. In November 1942 alone, U-boats sank 117 Allied ships. The rate of construction could not keep pace with the rate of destruction. For every new Liberty ship launched in an American shipyard, 2 merchantmen were being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. The British Admiralty calculated that if the losses continued at that rate, Britain would be forced to sue for peace within 6 months. The U-boat arm was not just winning, it was strangling the Allied war effort. And the U-boat commanders believed they were untouchable. These were not ordinary sailors. They were the elite of the Kriegsmarine, hand-picked for intelligence, aggression, and nerves of cold steel. They lived in conditions that would break most men, weeks submerged in claustrophobic steel tubes that reeked of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and fear. They endured depth charge attacks that could rupture eardrums and crack ribs. They operated under a doctrine of total warfare, targeting military and civilian vessels alike, knowing that every tanker sunk was one less shipment of fuel for Allied bombers. Every freighter destroyed was one less convoy of tanks rolling toward Berlin. They were hunters, and for years they had no natural predator. The Allies tried everything. Convoys were organized into tight defensive formations, surrounded by escorts that dropped depth charges at the slightest hint of a sonar contact. Aircraft patrols were increased. New technologies were tested, as did sonar, radar, direction-finding equipment, but none of it was enough. The U-boats adapted. They traveled in wolf packs, coordinating attacks to overwhelm convoy defenses. They attacked at night on the surface, where sonar was useless and their low profiles made them nearly invisible. They retreated to the mid-Atlantic Gap, a stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, where they could hunt without fear of aerial attack. The British escorts were too few, too slow, and too lightly armed. The older destroyers were being pulled from convoy duty to support amphibious operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean. The corvettes that remained were good for chasing surface U-boats, but had no answer for a submerged wolf pack operating with tactical precision. Then, in the winter of 1942, the Americans entered the fight. Not just with ships, but with an industrial system that the Germans had fundamentally misunderstood. When the United States Navy began commissioning destroyer escorts in mass, the German High Command dismissed them as desperation measures. Small, cheap, ineffective ships thrown together to plug gaps in a failing defense. Intelligence reports described them as underarmed and underarmored, suitable only for coastal patrol work. The U-boat commanders joked about them in the officers' mess. They called them tin cans and bathtub boats. They assumed the Americans were simply building more targets. They were catastrophically wrong. The American destroyer escorts were not desperate stopgaps. They were the product of a deliberate, methodical engineering philosophy that prioritized one goal above all others: killing submarines. The Buckley-class, Evarts-class, and Cannon-class destroyer escorts that began arriving in the Atlantic in early 1943 were smaller than fleet destroyers. Yes, but they were faster than any U-boat on the surface, more maneuverable in rough seas, and equipped with weapons systems that had been designed from the ground up for anti-submarine warfare. They carried forward-firing Hedgehog mortars that could saturate an area with contact-fused projectiles, eliminating the dead time that traditional depth charges required. They mounted the latest sonar arrays, capable of tracking submerged contacts at ranges the Germans thought impossible, and they were built in staggering numbers. Between 1943 and 1945, American shipyards launched over 500 destroyer escorts. 500. The Germans were still building U-boats one at a time in heavily bombed shipyards. The Americans were stamping out sub-hunters on assembly lines, but technology alone was not the weapon. It was the men who crewed those ships, and the doctrine they brought with them, a doctrine born not from tradition but from cold, ruthless pragmatism. The United States Navy had studied every convoy battle, every U-boat attack, every failed depth charge run. They analyzed the data with the same methodical precision they applied to building the atomic bomb. They identified patterns. They discovered that U-boats, for all their vaunted stealth, operated within predictable parameters. Submerged speed was limited. Battery endurance was finite. Evasion tactics followed recognizable patterns. The Americans turned submarine hunting into a science, and then they turned that science into a training regimen that was drilled into every sonar operator, every helmsman, every gunnery officer on every destroyer escort that left port. They didn't hunt submarines by instinct or luck. They hunted them with math. The transformation began in the spring of 1943, and it was swift and merciless. In March, the wolf packs mounted their largest coordinated offensive of the war, targeting convoys SC-122 and HX-229 in a 5-day running battle that stretched across 1,000 miles of ocean. They sank 21 ships. It was the highest total of the war, and the German naval staff celebrated it as proof that the Atlantic was still theirs. But it was the last gasp of a dying strategy. In April, the first American hunter-killer groups arrived, task forces built around escort carriers and destroyer escorts, operating independently of convoys, hunting U-boats in their own patrol zones. Within weeks, the kill rate reversed. In May 1943, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, 41, in a single month. The loss rate was unsustainable, and Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz knew it. He ordered the Wolf packs to withdraw from the North Atlantic. For the first time since 1939, the convoy routes were open. The U-boat men could not comprehend what had happened. They had gone from apex predators to hunted prey in a matter of weeks. Survivors who made it back to port told stories that sounded like hallucinations. They described destroyers that could track them at depth, even when they were running silent. They spoke of Hedgehog salvos that detonated on contact with the hull, punching through steel plating like it was paper. They reported aircraft appearing out of nowhere in the mid-Atlantic gap, carrier-based planes that should not have been there, dropping homing torpedoes that chased submarines through evasive maneuvers. The old tactics no longer worked. Diving deep didn't help. The new depth charges could reach crush depth. Running on the surface didn't help. The destroyers were faster, and their radar could track a periscope mast in a storm. Scattering didn't help. The Americans coordinated their attacks with a level of communication and precision that seemed almost supernatural. The U-boats were being systematically eradicated, and there was nothing the Kriegsmarine could do to stop it. Captain Lieutenant Hermann Eckhart, trapped in the flooding wreck of U-432, understood this in the final minutes of his life. The destroyer above him, USS Bari, DD-215, had locked onto his submarine with sonar and was prosecuting the contact with a cold, mechanical efficiency that left no room for escape. Depth charges walked closer with each salvo. The hull groaned under the pressure. Men prayed in the darkness. Eckhart gave the order to surface and abandon ship, but the ballast tanks were damaged and the boat hung at an uncontrollable angle, bow down, stern rising. When the final charge detonated directly beneath the conning tower, the explosion crushed the control room like a tin can under a boot. U-432 sank with all hands. It was one of 41 kills that month. A statistic, a confirmation that the North Atlantic no longer belonged to Germany. The symbolic object of this transformation was not a weapon or a piece of technology. It was a sound, the rhythmic, insistent ping of American sonar. To the U-boat crews, that sound became the auditory embodiment of American industrial power. It was everywhere. It followed them through evasive maneuvers. It echoed through the hull even when they were running silent, as if the destroyers above could hear their thoughts. It was relentless, unyielding, unstoppable. German submariners began to crack under the psychological strain. Some refused to dive. Others abandoned their posts. The veteran commanders, the aces who had once terrorized the convoy routes with impunity, now found themselves paralyzed by the sound of active sonar, knowing that once it locked onto them, escape was nearly impossible. The ping was more than a tool of detection. It was a message: we see you, we are faster than you, we are coming. And the Americans were coming, not in dozens but in hundreds. By the end of 1943, the United States had more than 200 destroyer escorts operational in the Atlantic, supported by escort carriers, long-range patrol bombers, and a coast-to-coast convoy system that moved cargo with assembly line efficiency. The German response was to build more U-boats, but it was a futile gesture. American shipyards were launching new destroyer escorts faster than the Kriegsmarine could replace lost submarines. The mathematics were brutal. For every U-boat commissioned, the Americans launched 3 sub-hunters. The kill-to-loss ratio shifted from 2-to-1 in favor of Germany to 10-to-1 in favor of the Allies. By 1944, it was 20-to-1. U-boat losses climbed to 70% per patrol. Crews stopped saying goodbye to each other before leaving port. They simply nodded and walked aboard, knowing they were unlikely to return. The German High Command tried to spin it. Propaganda films showed smiling U-boat crews receiving medals and iron crosses. Radio broadcasts praised their bravery and sacrifice. But the men who actually fought in the Atlantic knew the truth. They had lost. The Americans had not just matched the U-boat threat. They had systematically dismantled it with the kind of industrial and technological supremacy that left no room for heroism or tactics to matter. It was not a fair fight. It was an execution. The emotional contrast was total. In 1941, U-boat commanders had swaggered through the officers' clubs in Lorient and Brest, trading stories of tonnage sunk and convoys scattered. They wore white caps and silk scarves. They were celebrities. By 1944, they were ghosts. The new recruits were teenagers, hastily trained, sent to sea in boats that had become floating coffins. Veterans who survived their patrols returned hollow-eyed and silent. There were no more victory celebrations. The U-boat bases were bombed relentlessly. The concrete submarine pens that had once seemed invincible were crumbling under the weight of 1,000-pound bombs dropped by American B-17s. The hunters had become the hunted, and there was no escape. The historical evidence is unambiguous. Between 1939 and 1945, the German Navy commissioned 1,162 U-boats. Of those, 783 were destroyed. Not captured, not scuttled, destroyed. Sunk by depth charges, torpedoes, aircraft mines, or hunted to exhaustion and forced to surface, where they were obliterated by naval gunfire. The casualty rate among U-boat crews was 75%, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the entire war. 30,000 German submariners went to sea. 28,000 did not come home. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of the United States Navy accounted for more than half of those kills. They hunted U-boats in all weather, at all hours, in every corner of the Atlantic. They operated with a cold professionalism that turned submarine warfare from a game of cat and mouse into an industrial slaughter. And the transformation was not just tactical, it was ideological. The U-boat service had been built on a mythology of individual excellence, of lone wolves striking from the shadows. The American response was the opposite. It was collective, systematic, and industrial. Every destroyer escort was part of a network. Every sonar contact was shared. Every kill was analyzed and the data fed back into training programs. There were no aces, no heroes. There were only results. The Americans did not romanticize the fight. They simply won it, with the same methodical efficiency they applied to building tanks, bombers, and aircraft carriers. They turned war into mass production, and mass production into annihilation. The symbolic ping of American sonar echoed through the cold Atlantic waters, and wherever it sounded, U-boats died. It became a ghost story among the surviving German submariners. The sound that meant death was close. They told each other that the Americans had machines that could see through water, that their sonar could track a boat from miles away, that their depth charges never missed. Some of it was true. Much of it was the product of exhausted, terrified minds trying to make sense of an enemy that fought with resources they could not comprehend. But the result was the same. The U-boat arm, which had once been the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was reduced to a broken, demoralized force that could no longer threaten Allied shipping. By mid-1944, convoys crossed the Atlantic without losing a single ship. The Battle of the Atlantic was over, and Germany had lost. The epilogue belongs to the survivors. After the war, former U-boat commanders were interviewed by Allied intelligence officers, and their testimonies were remarkably consistent. They spoke not of tactical failures or strategic errors, but of a fundamental miscalculation. They had believed that determination and skill could overcome material disadvantage. They had assumed that because they were willing to endure hardship and die for the Reich, they could outlast an enemy that seemed soft and undisciplined. They had been wrong. One former commander, asked to explain the defeat, said simply, "We fought bravely." They fought with everything. It was not a condemnation. It was an acknowledgement of a truth that the Axis powers learned too late, that industrial capacity, when fully mobilized, is a weapon more devastating than any torpedo or bomb. The Americans did not win the Battle of the Atlantic because they were better sailors or braver men. They won because they built more ships, trained more crews, developed better technology, and applied all of it with ruthless, systematic efficiency. They turned the ocean into a factory floor and the U-boats into scrap metal. The ping of sonar, that steady, relentless sound, became the auditory symbol of a larger truth. It was the sound of abundance meeting scarcity, of industrial democracy overwhelming totalitarian militarism, of a nation that could afford to build 500 destroyer escorts in 2 years while simultaneously constructing the world's largest bomber fleet, invading North Africa, and preparing for D-Day. The Germans had believed they could starve Britain into submission. Instead, they found themselves hunted to extinction by an enemy that treated submarine warfare not as a duel of honor, but as a problem to be solved with engineering, mathematics, and overwhelming force. The U-boat men had called it impossible. They had mocked the tin cans and bathtub boats. And then those boats sent 783 submarines to the ocean floor, and with them, the last hope that Germany could win the war at sea. The North Atlantic is quiet now. The convoy routes are peaceful, but somewhere in the cold black depths, 2,000 fathoms down, the wrecks of U-boats lie scattered across the ocean floor like tombstones in a graveyard that stretches from Newfoundland to the coast of Norway. And if you listen closely, in the silence of deep water, you can still hear it. The echo of a sound that once meant death. The steady, mechanical ping that told the U-boat men their time was up, and that the hunters had become the hunted. It is the sound of American power, patient and unstoppable, turning the impossible into the inevitable. The sound of 783 submarines meeting their end, not in glorious battle, but in cold, industrial efficiency. The sound of victory, measured not in heroism, but in hulls sent to the bottom, one after another, until there were no more left to sink.